They said it started with an act of defiance, a dog that refused to leave an old, creaking playground swing. No one could have guessed that in that stubborn, silent stance lay the key to a secret so dark it would haunt every heart in the neighborhood for years to come. On a humid afternoon in late summer, when the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the low hum of cicadas, the Maplewood playground looked every bit as ordinary as any other patch of reclaimed urban green. Children's laughter once rang out against the rustle of leaves and the gentle squeak of swings, yet on this day, an inexplicable stillness had settled. In the center of the playground, beneath a sky painted with streaks of copper and twilight blue, a medium-sized mutt had claimed an old, weathered swing. Its fur, mottled with patches of brown and white, bristled in the mild breeze as the creature sat unmoving, eyes fixed on a horizon only it could see. Nobody remembered the exact moment when the dog first appeared there, but for those who lived in the small town, its presence became as much a part of the daily landscape as the creaking swing itself. Local residents whispered that the dog, with its unyielding vigil, was more than just a stray, it was a guardian of memories too painful to forget. Every time a passerby attempted to shoo it away, the dog would only growl softly, as if warning that some truths were not to be disturbed. In the early hours of that fateful day, Martin Lawson, a quiet, middle-aged man who worked at the town's only bookstore, stumbled upon the scene while taking his habitual walk. He recalled how the dog's eyes seemed to burn with an intensity that belied the calm of its body. "It's as if it's waiting," Martin murmured to himself, an uneasy chill creeping up his spine. He had long suspected that something terrible had befallen the town many years ago, though he'd never dared to voice the thought aloud. His footsteps faltered before the swing, where the dog's gaze locked onto his with a look that was neither friendly nor hostile, but full of raw, unspoken sorrow. The origins of that sorrow lay in a tragedy that had once shattered the community. Years before, a young child, Emily, whose laughter had been the heartbeat of Maplewood, had vanished without a trace. The days following her disappearance were punctuated by desperate search parties, tearful vigils, and a town gripped by fear and disbelief. In hushed tones over coffee and in whispered prayers at midnight, people recounted the inexplicable events that led to the day Emily never returned home. No one could provide a definitive answer, and the mystery of her disappearance festered like an open wound in the collective memory. Over time, life in Maplewood had settled into a fragile routine. Yet, the playground swing became a silent monument to what was lost. It was on that swing, they recalled, that Emily had last been seen, a brief, fleeting glimpse of a giggling child chasing after a wayward balloon. The tragic irony was that even as the years passed, the swing remained, both a place of innocent play and a haunting reminder of a past that refused to be erased. As Martin lingered near the swing, he recalled a conversation with Mrs. Hensley, an elderly woman who had been one of the first to organize a search for Emily. Her voice, trembling with a mixture of grief and determination, had once confided, "That swing, it's as if it holds a memory that no one dares to forget. And that dog, maybe it knows something we don't." Those words resonated deeply with Martin now, as he watched the dog, unwavering and resolute, as if it was guarding the fragile boundary between memory and oblivion. Across town, in a modest house not far from the playground, Sarah Monroe, the mother of another child who had grown up in the shadow of the tragedy, sat by her window. The glass fogged with condensation as she stared out at the overgrown yard, her thoughts meandering back to the day Emily disappeared. Sarah's life had been irreversibly altered by that event. The disappearance had etched a permanent mark on her soul. Every creak of the swing, every rustle of the leaves in the wind, echoed the unresolved anguish of a loss too profound to articulate. The dog's presence was both a balm and a torment, a living reminder that the past, with its raw, unhealed wounds, was never truly gone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the playground was bathed in a blood-orange glow, a small group of residents gathered near the swing. They came not for ritual or for remembrance, but driven by an inexplicable compulsion to confront the mystery that still haunted their lives. Among them was Officer Daniels, a stoic man with kind eyes and a heavy heart, whose duty was to uphold the law, yet whose empathy bound him to the unspoken grief of the community. He had seen the dog many times over the years, always on that swing, its head cocked in a silent vigil. "There's something about that dog," he confided to a colleague one night, his voice low and resonant. "It's like it's carrying the weight of every unanswered question, every unshed tear." The night wore on, and as the gathering dispersed, the playground returned to its quiet, unsettling solitude. The dog remained, its dark eyes reflecting the scattered light of the distant street lamps. In that fragile moment between day and night, the ordinary world was pierced by the extraordinary, a visceral reminder that some wounds are never allowed to heal. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft creaking of the swing, as if it were whispering long-forgotten secrets to anyone who dared to listen. In the days that followed, the dog's defiance grew into a local legend. Neighbors began sharing stories of eerie encounters, a glimpse of the dog at odd hours near the swing, a soft whimper echoing in the dead of night, and even a fleeting sense that the air around the playground vibrated with sorrow. The local paper ran a small feature on the dog, speculating about its connection to the unsolved mystery of Emily's disappearance. Yet, despite all the attention, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The more people spoke about it, the more they sensed that there was something inexplicably real about the grief that clung to that playground. Martin, who had once felt a simple curiosity, found himself increasingly drawn back to that place. His footsteps, as if by some silent compulsion, carried him to the swing at different times of day. He would stand at a respectful distance, watching the dog as it sat there, unmoving, its eyes distant yet alert. In those moments, Martin felt an overwhelming surge of empathy, a mingling of compassion and a desperate need to understand. He began to document his visits, scribbling notes in a worn leather notebook, trying to piece together fragments of memory and emotion that fluttered around him like ghosts in the wind. One particularly stifling afternoon, when the heat shimmered on the pavement and the world seemed suspended in a haze of regret and longing, Martin witnessed a subtle but profound change. The dog, usually so still and unwavering, began to whimper softly as if in response to some internal ache. Its eyes, dark pools of sorrow, shifted briefly toward the direction of the nearby row of houses. In that moment, Martin was struck by the realization that the dog's presence was not merely about guarding a physical space, it was an act of mourning, a living memorial to a child whose absence had left a void too vast to fill. The playground, with its peeling paint and creaking metal, had become a crucible where joy and tragedy intermingled in a delicate, painful dance. It was here that the echoes of laughter collided with the silent, unyielding grief of loss. In the rustling leaves and the whispering wind, one could almost hear the faded echoes of a little girl's laughter, now transformed into a melancholic symphony of remembrance. The dog, with its unwavering presence, was the silent custodian of those echoes, a keeper of secrets that the playground itself refused to let die. Even as life in Maplewood continued, the playground stood as a testament to the lingering shadow of that unspeakable loss. Neighbors who once felt only the soft ache of nostalgia now sensed a disquieting tension, as if the very air held its breath in remembrance. Conversations in local diners, over steaming cups of coffee, shifted from everyday trivialities to whispered speculations about the true nature of the dog's vigil. What did it know that they did not? Was it a witness to events too terrible to recall, or perhaps the sole keeper of a sorrow that had seeped into every corner of the town? In the midst of this emotional tempest, the mundane routines of daily life continued. School buses rumbled along familiar routes, shops opened their doors to customers seeking comfort in the familiar, and yet every time someone passed by Maplewood Playground, they could not help but feel that they were being watched by an unseen presence. The dog's defiant occupation of the swing had transformed the playground into a stage for a silent drama, a drama that played out in the glances exchanged between strangers, in the tentative whispers of recollection, and in the unspoken acknowledgement that some stories were written not in ink, but in the scars of the heart. As dusk settled over Maplewood, painting the sky with the bruised colors of loss and memory, Martin's thoughts turned increasingly to the nature of remembrance. How could something so small, a dog on a swing, contain within it the weight of an entire community's grief? Yet every time he looked into the dog's eyes, he saw reflections of the past, of a child whose dreams had been abruptly cut short, of a family left to grapple with a void that no amount of time or comforting words could ever fill. In that poignant silence, where time seemed both to stand still and rush forward in equal measure, the everyday reality of Maplewood was forever altered. The playground was no longer just a playground, it had become a living, breathing chronicle of heartbreak and mystery, a place where the boundary between memory and the present blurred into an indistinguishable haze. And at the heart of it all, the dog remained, its unwavering presence a constant reminder that sometimes, the most profound truths are not revealed in grand gestures, but in the quiet persistence of a single, sorrowful soul. That stubborn, silent guardian on the swing continued to beckon those who dared to approach, drawing them into a web of emotions as intricate and painful as the finest lace. Its defiance was not merely a refusal to leave, it was an invitation to confront the unspoken, to acknowledge that within the simplest acts of daily life lie the deepest scars of loss. And as the night deepened, the playground, bathed in the melancholic glow of streetlights, bore silent witness to a truth that would haunt Maplewood for generations to come. In the days that followed, Martin's visits grew more frequent. He found himself standing on the fringes of the playground, lost in thought as he watched the dog and tried to unravel the threads of memory that connected the present to that fateful day. With each visit, he scribbled more notes in his leather notebook, piecing together the fragments of conversations overheard, the half-forgotten details of a community that had once been whole. There was an undeniable poetry in the interplay of light and shadow on the swing, an almost tangible tension between the innocent past and the stark, uncompromising reality of the present. And so, in the quiet corners of Maplewood, where everyday life met the extraordinary and unexpected moments, the story of the dog on the swing began to weave itself into the fabric of the town's collective memory. It was a story of loss and longing, of a mystery that refused to be laid to rest, a mystery that, in its own way, demanded to be remembered. The dog, with its steady, almost resigned gaze, had become the embodiment of that memory, a living reminder that some tragedies are so deeply etched into the soul of a community that even time itself cannot erase them. In this unassuming corner of the world, where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided, the playground remained a silent stage for the unfolding of a sorrowful drama. The dog's unyielding vigil, set against the backdrop of fading laughter and unspoken grief, was a quiet protest against forgetting, a fierce declaration that the past, no matter how painful, must never be allowed to slip away into oblivion. And as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, the playground held its breath, suspended in the delicate balance between memory and loss, between the innocence of a child's laughter and the unyielding, mournful truth that one precious soul had been lost forever. It was in that charged, unsettling atmosphere that the first echoes of a deeper mystery began to stir, one that would eventually lead to revelations that challenged everything the town thought it knew. For the dog, in its silent, unwavering way, had not merely taken up residence on the swing, it had become the keeper of a secret too painful to be spoken aloud, a secret that pulsed with the raw intensity of grief and the haunting promise of revelations yet to come. As the night drew on and the last vestiges of daylight faded into memory, the ordinary world of Maplewood receded into the background, leaving behind a singular, poignant truth. Sometimes, the most unassuming of moments can conceal the darkest of secrets, and a dog's quiet defiance can unlock a story of loss that refuses to be silenced. The days that followed brought an unsettling calm to Maplewood, a deceptive tranquility that masked an undercurrent of dread and unresolved grief. Martin found himself unable to shake the persistent pull of the playground, as if the very ground beneath his feet murmured secrets of a past too painful to bury. One overcast morning, he ventured back, notebook in hand, determined to unearth the threads that connected the relentless vigil of the dog with the deep scars of the town's history. At dawn, the playground was shrouded in a ghostly mist that softened the edges of reality. The familiar creak of the swing under the weight of an unseen past resonated like an echo in an empty hall. As Martin approached, the dog sat motionless, its eyes fixated on a point beyond the broken asphalt. The animal's presence was almost magnetic, drawing him closer with an inexplicable force. In that quiet, heavy silence, Martin felt the weight of every lost hope and shattered dream of Maplewood press against his chest. He recalled the hushed conversations of the town's elders, the whispered memories of a child whose laughter had once brought life to these grounds, and whose disappearance had left a void that no one could mend. With trembling fingers, he opened his notebook, his pen hovering as if it, too, was reluctant to disturb the solemn scene. Every stroke on the paper was a silent plea for understanding, an attempt to grasp the intangible sorrow that clung to the swing. The dog's eyes, deep and sorrowful, reflected a melancholy that Martin could not ignore. It was as if the creature was a living embodiment of the town's collective grief. Later that day, Martin sought refuge in a local diner, a modest, time-worn establishment that had served as a gathering spot for neighbors for decades. The diner's worn red booths and faded wallpaper bore witness to countless untold stories, and today, it became a sanctuary for his troubled thoughts. Over a cup of bitter coffee, he listened to murmurs from the other patrons. Their conversation was laced with a blend of nostalgia and anxiety, punctuated by cautious glances and long, haunted pauses. One of the older men, his voice quivering with raw emotion, recounted how the memory of that missing child had seeped into every corner of their lives. He spoke of the playground with a reverence bordering on fear, describing how every creak of the swing carried the echo of a lost innocence that the town could neither forget nor forgive. As the conversation unfolded, Martin began to piece together fragments of recollections, a neighbor who had once seen a flash of something, perhaps a figure or a fleeting shadow, near the swing on a rainy afternoon, a local teacher who recalled the moment a child's smile had vanished from a classroom forever changed by the tragedy. Each detail, as small as a whisper, wove itself into a tapestry of loss that enveloped the community. The dog, Martin mused, was not merely a stray, it was a keeper of these collective memories, a silent witness to the horror that had torn through their lives like a sudden, unprovoked storm. That very night, as a chill wind began to rustle through the streets, Martin found himself drawn to yet another place, the modest home of Sarah Monroe. In the dim light of her living room, Sarah's eyes glistened with the unspoken agony of a mother who had weathered a lifetime of silent mourning. Her home, filled with the soft hum of an old radio and the gentle tick of a grandfather clock, stood in stark contrast to the tempest of emotions raging within her. Over cups of lukewarm tea, she recounted the day she had seen the playground empty, its silence a harbinger of the unrelenting sorrow that had since claimed their neighborhood. Each word that escaped her lips was laden with a heavy, almost unbearable sadness, as if every syllable was an echo of a love forever lost. In the glow of that modest lamp, Sarah's story took on a life of its own, one that entwined the dog's relentless presence with the long, aching memory of her own shattered world. There was a time, she whispered, when that swing was filled with the sounds of laughter and dreams. Now, it's as if it mourns every hope that slipped away with the wind. Her voice wavered, and in that moment, the boundaries between memory and the present blurred, leaving only a raw, unfiltered pain. The revelation was subtle yet profound. The playground was not merely a physical space, but a vessel carrying the weight of innumerable sorrows, each one as tangible and crushing as the last. As days turned into weeks, Martin's investigation of the past began to unravel more than he had anticipated. Late one evening, while poring over old newspaper clippings in the quiet solitude of his study, he discovered a faded photograph tucked away between the yellowed pages, a photograph of the playground, taken on the day before the tragedy. In the image, the swing, swaying gently in a late afternoon breeze, held a mysterious, almost spectral quality. And there, in the blurred background, a small figure could be seen, a child with a smile that seemed to defy the inevitable sorrow of the coming days. The photograph was a poignant reminder of a life abruptly disrupted, a life that had been stolen by forces too elusive to understand, yet too powerful to forget. Haunted by the image and driven by a desperate need for answers, Martin began to seek out those who had been closest to the events of that fateful day. He visited the local police station, where a veteran officer, Officer Daniels, reluctantly revisited memories that were as raw as open wounds. In a quiet conversation held in a back room filled with the musty scent of old case files, Daniels shared details that had long been buried beneath layers of official reports and whispered rumors. He spoke of the chaos that had ensued in the immediate aftermath, of frantic calls and fruitless searches, and of the inexplicable silence that had followed. The officer's recollections were laced with an almost tangible bitterness, a sentiment that echoed the community's unspoken belief that something was amiss, something that defied conventional explanation. The police files, sparse and unsatisfying in their official detachment, only deepened the mystery for Martin. There were gaps where answers should have been, questions that hung in the air like a dense fog that refused to lift. Each unanswered query was a puzzle piece that fit into a larger, incomprehensible picture, a picture in which the dog on the swing seemed to occupy a central, almost fated position. It was as if the animal had emerged from the depths of memory itself, summoned by a grief that transcended time and logic. Back at the playground one rain-soaked afternoon, Martin stood under the skeletal branches of an old oak tree, watching the rain paint somber patterns on the cracked pavement. The dog was there, its fur darkened by the falling droplets, yet its eyes shone with an inner light that defied the gloom. In that charged atmosphere, the boundaries between the mundane and the extraordinary dissolved once more. The rhythmic pitter-patter of rain on metal, the soft hum of distant traffic, and the mournful creak of the swing blended into a symphony of heartache, a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life, the echoes of loss could resurface at any moment. The interplay of light and shadow on that rain-washed day stirred something within Martin, a raw, visceral determination to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He began to see the playground not just as a relic of the past, but as an active participant in the ongoing narrative of Maplewood sorrow. Every creak of the swing, every rustle of leaves in the wind, was a heartbeat of the town's collective grief. And the dog, steadfast and enigmatic, was its silent narrator, a creature whose unwavering gaze beckoned him to explore the darkest recesses of memory. In the following weeks, the fabric of Maplewood's daily life continued to ripple with an undercurrent of tension. Ordinary activities, a child's game of hopscotch on a cracked sidewalk, a neighbor's friendly wave from a sunlit porch, were all tinged with an unspoken awareness of the playground's lingering presence. It was as if the entire town had become a canvas upon which the echoes of the past were being continuously re-etched. Every passerby, every hushed conversation, carried the weight of that inexplicable sorrow, a sorrow that had seeped into every crack and crevice of their existence. Amid this delicate interplay of memory and reality, Martin's own world began to fracture under the strain of what he had uncovered. The relentless search for meaning had become an obsession, a journey that led him to confront not only the ghostly remnants of a child's lost laughter but also the raw, unhealed wounds within his own soul. His nights grew restless, haunted by dreams of endless playgrounds and an echoing silence punctuated by a single, defiant whimper. In those dreams, the dog appeared as both a harbinger of despair and a beacon of unspoken truth, urging him to continue on a path that twisted between hope and hopelessness. One particularly disquieting evening, as a fierce storm raged outside his modest apartment, Martin felt an irresistible compulsion to return to the playground. The tempest outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within, the wild winds and lashing rain echoing the cacophony of thoughts racing through his mind. Clad in a worn raincoat, he stepped into the deluge, each drop of rain a stinging reminder of the past's unyielding grip. The playground, illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning, was a landscape transformed, its familiar contours now twisted into something eerie and surreal. Under the tempest's relentless assault, the dog remained, unmoved and resolute. Its eyes glowed with a strange intensity that cut through the chaos of the storm. Martin's heart pounded in tandem with the thunder, and as he drew near, he could almost hear the distant echoes of a child's laughter mingling with the howl of the wind. In that surreal moment, the boundary between memory and the present evaporated, leaving him with an overwhelming sense of both dread and longing, a longing to reclaim a fragment of innocence lost long ago. With every step he took, the storm seemed to recite fragments of an ancient lament, a dirge that spoke of unhealed wounds and the desperate need for closure. And yet, even as nature's fury battered around him, Martin sensed a fragile, almost imperceptible glimmer of resolve, a promise that somewhere within the maze of memories and sorrow lay the key to understanding the dog's unyielding vigil and the deeper mystery it guarded. In the aftermath of that stormy night, as the rain slowly receded and dawn broke with a hesitant promise of light, Martin was left with more questions than answers. The playground, now bathed in the soft, tentative glow of early morning, stood as both a sanctuary and a mausoleum, a place where the living and the lost coexisted in a fragile, unspoken truce. The dog, its fur matted and eyes still alight with an ineffable sorrow, sat atop the swing as if challenging the new day to unveil its secrets. In that quiet, reflective moment, Martin knew that the journey had only just begun. The raw, unyielding memories that had once been relegated to the shadowy corners of Maplewood were demanding to be acknowledged, and he was determined to follow every thread until the truth, however painful, emerged from the darkness. And so, with the dawning light as his silent witness, he vowed to persist, driven by a deep-seated need to honor the lost, to confront the sorrow etched into every weathered swing, and to finally understand the unspoken story that the dog on the playground had guarded for so long. The relentless pursuit of answers drew Martin deeper into the labyrinth of Maplewood's buried secrets. As autumn's chill began to seep into the bones of the town, the once familiar playground transformed under a canopy of dying leaves. Its every creak and whisper now echoed like the murmurs of long-forgotten confessions. Martin's resolve hardened with each visit. The dog, still perched upon the swing with its steady, sorrowful gaze, served as both sentinel and enigma, a living testament to the tragedy that had splintered the community. That morning, beneath a slate-grey sky, Martin returned to the playground with a single, burning question that gnawed at him relentlessly. Why had this unyielding guardian chosen that very swing as its post? His footsteps, measured and determined, carried him past the dilapidated fence and along a narrow path lined with brittle leaves. Every sound, the rustle of wind through barren branches, the distant hum of early commuters, seemed to conspire with the silence, urging him to listen closer to the hidden layers of the day. At the center of the playground, the dog remained motionless. Its dark eyes, flecked with hints of past sorrows, seemed to communicate in a language beyond words. Martin's hand trembled as he reached out to lightly brush the splintered wood of the swing, a silent greeting to a familiar relic of lost innocence. In that tactile moment, the rough texture under his fingers merged with the weight of his memories, each splinter a shard of a past too painful to ignore. Later, determined to unearth more fragments of a truth obscured by time, Martin made his way to the town's modest library, a sanctuary of worn books and quiet corners that had served as a repository for the community's collective history. The library's somber interior, with its high ceilings and dust-moted sunlight piercing through tall windows, held a calm that belied the storm of emotions churning within him. Here, amidst the faded records and brittle newspapers, he scoured archives in search of any mention of the day that had forever altered Maplewood. In the hushed corridors of the library, Martin uncovered a trove of forgotten reports and handwritten notes, a mosaic of recollections that painted a picture of an ordinary day shattered by an extraordinary loss. A yellowed article, its headline barely legible, recounted the frantic search for the missing child, describing how community members had combed every inch of the neighborhood in desperate hope. One particular detail snagged his attention, a mention of an eyewitness account that had once sparked both curiosity and dread among those who remembered. The report hinted that a local resident had seen a stranger loitering near the playground just hours before the tragedy, a detail that had been dismissed as an anomaly at the time, but now seemed laden with implications. Armed with this new clue, Martin felt a surge of urgency, a need to connect these fragmented memories into a coherent narrative. That very evening, as a bitter wind rattled the window panes of his small apartment, he set out to revisit one of the locations that had long resonated with both grief and possibility, the modest home of Officer Daniels. In that space, where the sterile scent of old paper met the quiet dignity of a life spent upholding justice, the veteran officer had once confided details that remained stubbornly obscured by official reports. Officer Daniels, whose once firm eyes now softened with the weight of unspoken regrets, welcomed Martin into a room cluttered with relics of a bygone era, a worn leather chair here, a box of faded photographs there. Over cups of bitter, cooling coffee, Daniels recounted that fateful day with a tone that was both matter-of-fact and laden with remorse. He described the chaotic scramble that had ensued as neighbors, overcome with panic and desperation, converged on the playground. Amid the clamor, a single figure, a stranger with an unsettling calm, had been seen watching from afar. Daniels admitted that his memory of the event was fragmented, the case files sparse and unsatisfying. Yet, the officer's eyes betrayed a lingering suspicion that the disappearance had been more than a tragic accident, it was a wound that the town had never truly allowed to heal. Haunted by these revelations, Martin left the station with the weight of unanswered questions pressing upon him. He retraced his steps back to the playground under a sky that had surrendered to twilight. The air, cool and laden with the scent of impending rain, carried whispers of regret and unfulfilled promises. Standing once more before the defiant dog, Martin felt as though he were gazing into the very soul of the town, a mirror reflecting every loss, every lingering hope. In the silence of that moment, the boundaries between past and present blurred with a disquieting fluidity. The playground, a site of childhood mirth now shadowed by grief, unfolded like a layered tapestry of memory. Every rustle of wind and creak of metal held within it a spark of truth, a truth that the dog, in its steadfast vigil, seemed determined to reveal. Martin's inner voice urged him to push beyond the surface, to venture deeper into the dark recesses where the real story lay hidden among fragments of memory and bitter regret. Over the next several days, as the chill of early winter began to set in, Martin's investigation took on a relentless momentum. Late one afternoon, while revisiting the library's archives, he discovered a collection of letters tucked away in an unassuming drawer, a cache of correspondence between a local journalist and a concerned citizen from decades past. The letters, penned in careful, trembling script, spoke of inexplicable events and unsettling coincidences. One letter, in particular, drew his attention. It described a series of observations made on the day of the disappearance, observations that hinted at a subtle interplay of human frailty and calculated indifference. The writer noted that the playground had taken on an almost spectral quality that day, its every detail marked by an uncanny precision that defied the randomness of tragedy. The contents of the letter sent a shiver down Martin's spine. Its words, stark and unyielding, challenged the sanitized version of events that had been recorded in the official reports. According to the correspondent, the incident was not a mere accident but the culmination of a series of overlooked details, a missing piece in a puzzle that had never been fully assembled. The dog on the swing, the letter suggested in a tone both accusing and mournful, was not simply an animal with a strange attachment. It was a silent witness to an act of calculated negligence, a living repository of guilt that had been passed from one generation to the next. Driven by this incendiary revelation, Martin felt an almost overwhelming need to confront those who had once wielded power in Maplewood, those whose silence had allowed the truth to fester. He arranged a meeting with an elderly council member, a man whose once robust voice had been gradually eroded by the passage of years and the burden of unspoken truths. In a cramped, dimly lit office, the council member, Mr. Hargrove, was initially reticent. But as Martin's probing questions nudged at the fragile veneer of polite indifference, the old man's defiance gave way to a reluctant confession. Mr. Hargrove recalled that on the day of the tragedy, there had been a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that, in retrospect, painted a damning portrait of systemic failure. Budget cuts had led to the neglect of safety protocols at the playground, and a series of bureaucratic oversights had allowed a lone, unaccountable figure to wander unchecked. "We tried to cover it up," Mr. Hargrove murmured, his eyes darting to a faded photograph pinned to the wall, a photograph of the very playground in its brighter days. Not out of malice, but fear. Fear of what the truth might do to us all. His confession, whispered in the fragile intimacy of that room, sent a cascade of doubts and disillusionment through Martin's mind. Armed with these painful truths, Martin's internal narrative began to shift. The dog, the playground, even the silent halls of the library, all were part of a larger mosaic of human frailty, a story of collective guilt and sorrow that had defined Maplewood for far too long. The realization that the tragedy might have been compounded by systemic neglect, rather than a singular, inexplicable event, imbued the mystery with a sense of accountability, a call to confront not only the ghosts of the past, but the living echoes of their mistakes. Back at the playground on a bitterly cold evening, as fog crept over the ground like a spectral shroud, Martin lingered in the shadow of the swing. The dog, its fur thick with the chill of the night, regarded him with an inscrutable calm. In that quiet, heart-wrenching moment, Martin understood that the answers he sought were not to be found in a single, dramatic revelation but in the cumulative weight of small, painful truths. Each creak of the swing, every gust of wind that stirred the fallen leaves, was a testament to the community's enduring sorrow, a silent, persistent reminder that the past was never truly dead. In the depths of that night, as Martin retreated from the playground with a heavy yet resolute heart, he carried with him the unyielding belief that the truth, no matter how bitter or complex, could one day mend the fractured narrative of Maplewood. And while the dog remained its quiet sentinel, the echoes of its vigil had begun to stitch together the disparate threads of memory into a tapestry that, for the first time in decades, might offer a path toward redemption and healing. In the lingering twilight of a bitter winter day, Martin's relentless pursuit of truth began to weave an intricate tapestry of revelations that spanned the hidden corners of Maplewood. The chill in the air mirrored the cold detachment that had long settled over the town, a quiet resignation to a past that no one dared disturb. Yet, with each new discovery, Martin felt an urgent fire reigniting within him, driving him to unearth the secrets that had long been buried under layers of collective guilt and sorrow. Late that afternoon, as the setting sun cast long, trembling shadows across the snow-dusted pavement, Martin received an unexpected call from a woman named Evelyn. she claimed to have known Emily's family, a connection that had been carefully concealed for decades. Evelyn's voice was soft and hesitant, heavy with memories of a time when hope still flickered amid despair. In a voice barely above a whisper, she recounted the day of the disappearance from the perspective of someone who had seen more than most cared to remember. Evelyn described a series of inexplicable occurrences on that fateful day, glimpses of a stranger lingering near the playground, hushed arguments behind closed doors, and a pervasive sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into every crack of the old neighborhood. According to her, the disappearance was not merely an accident, but the culminating act of a series of oversights and deliberate choices. Her words carried the weight of long-held secrets and unspoken remorse, and they left Martin with an unsettling conviction: the tragedy that had shattered Maplewood was woven into the very fabric of its governance and the hearts of those who had once turned a blind eye. Motivated by Evelyn's testimony, Martin set out to visit the modest, weathered house where she now resided, a relic of a bygone era marked by faded photographs and delicate porcelain that spoke of better times. The interior was modest and unpretentious, its silence punctuated by the ticking of an antique clock and the soft murmur of distant memories. Over cups of lukewarm tea, Evelyn gently unfolded the layers of her recollections. She spoke of late-night meetings in hushed tones, of frantic whispers exchanged in shadowed hallways, and of the pervasive dread that had haunted the corridors of the local council. It wasn't just a missing child, Evelyn confided, her eyes glistening with both sorrow and defiance. It was a prelude to a series of decisions made in the name of progress, decisions that cost us more than we ever realized. The playground wasn't maintained, the reports were half-written, and the truth was locked away with the rest of our collective mistakes. Her words resonated deeply with Martin, who had long suspected that the tragedy was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a broader malaise that had festered within the town's institutions. Returning to the playground that evening, Martin was struck by how the landscape seemed to bear the scars of time and neglect even more profoundly. The swing, its chains rusted and its seat weathered, creaked under the weight of memories that refused to fade. The dog, ever vigilant, sat as though guarding not only the physical space but also the intangible repository of all the town's sorrows. As a frigid wind swept through, stirring dead leaves into restless spirals, Martin felt that the playground had become a living monument, a solemn reminder of promises broken and lives altered irreversibly by a single, heart-wrenching day. Under the bleak light of a waning moon, Martin began to assemble the fragments of his investigation. Each piece of evidence, old letters, faded photographs, whispered testimonies, formed a mosaic that pointed to deliberate negligence and the quiet complicity of those in power. He recalled the furtive glances of Officer Daniels, the resigned confessions of Mr. Hargrove, and the unguarded words of Evelyn. All of them hinted at a tapestry of human frailty and bureaucratic indifference that had allowed the tragedy to spiral into an enduring wound. Late one night, compelled by a mixture of determination and an almost overwhelming sense of impending revelation, Martin returned once again to the playground. The harsh, cold light of a single street lamp revealed every detail: the chipped paint on the swing, the faint outline of scuff marks on the pavement, and the steady, unblinking gaze of the dog. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The dog's eyes, deep pools of sorrow and resolve, seemed to challenge Martin to piece together the hidden truths that lay dormant in the silence. In that charged moment, the landscape of Maplewood transformed before him. The playground was no longer merely a relic of childhood innocence, it had become a crucible for the town's collective guilt. Every broken slat of the swing, every muted sound in the still night, spoke of negligence and despair. Martin's heart ached as he considered the profound irony. A place once filled with laughter had been turned into a monument of quiet suffering, a place where each creak of metal was an echo of a promise broken long ago. His mind wandered to the countless voices that had contributed to this unfolding narrative, voices that had long been silenced by fear, shame, or resignation. He could almost hear the soft whispers of remorse from those who had chosen convenience over accountability. The evidence, though piecemeal and often circumstantial, began to form an outline of an uncomfortable truth: the disappearance of Emily was not an isolated tragedy, but the culminating consequence of systemic failures that had haunted Maplewood for years. Over the following days, as winter's grip tightened around the town, Martin's investigation took on an increasingly personal tone. he reached out to more residents, quietly coaxing from them memories of that long-ago day. In hushed conversations at local diners and in the corners of small, overstuffed living rooms, he collected fragments of testimonies that painted a picture of quiet desperation, a community that had learned to accept loss as an unchangeable part of its identity. Each story was imbued with a raw, aching realism that both pained and compelled him. One elderly man, whose lined face bore the marks of sorrow and resignation, recalled the frantic pace of that day with a trembling voice. "We thought it was just an accident at first," he said, his eyes distant as if peering back through decades. "But the way things were handled, the way no one seemed to care, there was something off, something that left a stain on all of us." His words, though simple, reverberated with a heavy finality that left Martin questioning the integrity of those entrusted with protecting the town. The investigation led Martin to a crumbling community center, once a vibrant hub of local gatherings, where he discovered additional records that had been largely forgotten. In the dim light of a storage room, dust mote swirling in the beams of his flashlight, he uncovered a set of documents that hinted at a deliberate cover-up. These papers, yellowed with age and hastily annotated in the margins, described internal discussions about budget reallocations, safety inspections that were never carried out, and a series of warnings that were dismissed without a second thought. It was a stark reminder that behind the veneer of civic pride lay a labyrinth of missteps and moral compromises that had silently conspired to let the tragedy fester. Every new piece of evidence added to the mounting pressure that Martin felt, a pressure that came not only from the weight of the past, but also from the realization that his own life was becoming inextricably linked to the dark narrative of Maplewood. Late nights in his cramped apartment were now filled with feverish scribblings in his notebook, his thoughts racing as he connected dots that had long been obscured by time. The dog's steadfast presence on the playground became a recurring motif in his mind, a symbol of both relentless loyalty and a haunting reminder of the cost of truth. One particularly frigid evening, as a bitter wind rattled the window panes and the snow fell in silent, relentless drifts, Martin's investigation reached a critical juncture. In the quiet of the early hours, he found himself drawn to an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town, an area that had once been slated for development but now lay dormant, overtaken by nature and neglect. Rumors had circulated for years about clandestine meetings held there, about voices raised in anger, and whispers of betrayal that echoed through the empty corridors of a long-forgotten building. Martin's heart pounded with both trepidation and determination as he stepped cautiously through the desolate landscape, every crunch of snow underfoot a stark reminder of the secrets that lay buried in the cold. Inside the decaying structure, amid shattered windows and peeling paint, Martin discovered further clues, handwritten notes that alluded to deals struck in desperation, promises made in the dark, and the quiet acceptance of loss as the price of progress. The documents, fragile and brittle with age, spoke of a collusion between local authorities and influential figures whose names had long been shrouded in mystery. As he pieced together these fragments, a chilling picture emerged. The disappearance of Emily was not merely an unfortunate accident but a byproduct of a calculated, systemic failure, a failure that had silently condemned a child to a fate unknown. Haunted by the implications of these revelations, Martin emerged from the building with a heavy heart and a mind teeming with unanswered questions. The stark winter night offered little solace, its icy breath a constant reminder that the truth was as unforgiving as the cold. Yet, as he made his way back through the deserted streets of Maplewood, illuminated only by the intermittent glow of streetlights, Martin felt a renewed determination. The truth, no matter how bitter, demanded to be told. And as long as the dog maintained its vigil on that weathered swing, as long as the playground stood as a silent monument to a past that refused to fade, he would continue to follow the trail of sorrow until every hidden secret was brought into the harsh light of day. In the days that followed, the town of Maplewood began to stir with a subtle but unmistakable change. Whispers turned into tentative conversations, and the long-suppressed memories of that tragic day began to resurface. Neighbors who had once avoided the playground now found themselves drawn to it, a silent congregation of souls yearning for closure, for acknowledgement of the pain that had been carefully masked by years of quiet resignation. In the soft, persistent murmur of these voices, Martin detected both a plea for redemption and a demand for accountability. The dog on the swing, ever the silent guardian, watched over these unfolding events with an inscrutable calm. Its unwavering presence seemed to symbolize the inexorable link between past and present, between loss and the fragile hope of healing. And as Martin continued his investigation, delving deeper into the dark heart of Maplewood, he knew that every step he took brought him closer to confronting not only the legacy of a single, shattering tragedy, but also the enduring scars that had defined the lives of an entire community. In that relentless pursuit of truth, the boundaries between right and wrong, between justice and complicity, began to blur. Martin's journey was no longer just about piecing together an unsolved mystery. It had evolved into a quest to reconcile with the collective guilt and unspoken grief that had long held Maplewood in its icy grip. Each revelation, each painful confession, served as both an anchor and a catalyst, binding him irrevocably to a story that was as much about the human condition as it was about a single, tragic day. And so, as the winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Martin pressed on. With every new lead, with every quiet conversation in the shadowed corners of forgotten buildings, he felt the weight of responsibility to honor the memory of the lost and to ensure that the truth, however harsh, would not be buried again. The playground, with its creaking swing and steadfast canine sentinel, remained at the heart of this dark chronicle, a place where memories converged, where the past and present intertwined in a dance of sorrow and unyielding resolve. The journey ahead was fraught with peril and uncertainty, yet Martin's determination never wavered. For in the silent vigil of that lone dog, in the broken echoes of a community's grief, he saw not only the legacy of a tragic loss, but also the possibility of redemption, a promise that, one day, the truth might finally set them free. In the waning days of winter, as the brittle light of dusk began to soften the edges of Maplewood's hardened facade, Martin found himself at the crossroads of revelation and reconciliation. His investigation, which had spiraled into a painstaking quest for truth, now culminated in a fragile hope that the community might finally unburden itself of the weight of its past. The playground, once a silent monument to sorrow and negligence, pulsed with a quiet urgency that beckoned every weary soul to confront what had long been hidden. On a crisp evening marked by an unusually still air, Martin arranged a gathering at the heart of the town. Neighbors, long resigned to whispered memories and hushed regrets, trickled into the community hall, a modest building that had once been the stage for lighter moments in their collective history. There, amidst the faded photographs and worn furniture, the residents of Maplewood sat in expectant silence as Martin, with a voice tempered by both resolve and the scars of endless nights, began to recount the story that had slowly emerged from the shadows. Every detail he spoke of, the crumbling records in the library, the guarded confessions from Officer Daniels and Mr. Hargrove, the furtive testimony of Evelyn, and the clandestine documents uncovered in the abandoned lot, was woven together into a tapestry that exposed not a singular, isolated tragedy, but a series of systemic failures and human frailties. His words, heavy with the burden of evidence, resonated through the hall like a long-forgotten dirge. For many, the revelation was a bitter pill, a mirror reflecting not only the sorrow of a lost child, but also the collective guilt that had allowed the neglect to continue unabated. Outside, the old playground stood as a quiet sentinel beneath a sky streaked with the remnants of twilight. The dog remained on the swing, its presence as constant and inscrutable as ever. For the townspeople, it had come to embody a solemn reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, could never be entirely forgotten. As the community began to grapple with the truth laid bare, a palpable tension mingled with an undercurrent of resolve. There was a shared recognition that healing could only begin with acknowledgement, that the silence which had once shrouded the playground must now be broken by voices united in a quest for accountability. In the days that followed the gathering, conversations flourished in every corner of Maplewood. Former adversaries found themselves united by the common goal of confronting a history that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. The town council, once reticent and evasive, began to organize public forums where residents could speak freely, their words echoing with the raw emotion of remembered loss. With every meeting, every hushed testimony, the community's collective resolve to mend its fractured past grew stronger. Martin, standing at the periphery of these emerging dialogues, felt both the weight of his own scars and the stirring of something new, a cautious optimism that truth, even when painful, could pave the way toward redemption. His nightly visits to the playground became less solitary vigils of despair and more reflective pilgrimages toward closure. Under the indifferent glow of streetlights, he would pause to watch the dog on the swing, its dark eyes fixed on some distant horizon. In those moments, he no longer saw an enigma but a steadfast guardian of memory, a silent custodian bearing witness to every heartache, every promise broken, and every small victory achieved through the honest confrontation of a painful past. Then came the day when the town, buoyed by its own collective strength, decided to mark a symbolic turning point. A modest memorial was erected near the playground, a simple bench accompanied by a plaque inscribed with the names of all who had been touched by the tragedy. It was a gesture that acknowledged the profound loss while also affirming a commitment to never let the truth slip away into silence once more. Standing before the memorial, many in Maplewood shed tears not only for the child whose absence had left a void too vast to measure, but also for the years lost to denial and the bitter sting of unspoken remorse. In that charged atmosphere, Martin felt his own journey come full circle. The relentless search for answers had led him to a place where the individual and the collective converged, a space where memories, however painful, could be transformed into a beacon of accountability and hope. The dog, still sitting on the creaking swing as if guarding the very soul of the playground, served as a poignant reminder that while the scars of the past might never fully fade, they could inspire a determination to build a future defined by honesty and compassion. As spring slowly began to stir the barren branches of winter, Maplewood took its tentative first steps toward healing. The harsh truths unearthed by Martin's investigation, though searing in their clarity, also held the promise of change. In the gentle murmur of community conversations, in the quiet resolve to face the past without flinching, there emerged a profound understanding that, while some wounds might never completely close, the courage to acknowledge them was the first step toward redemption. The final echoes of that long and painful journey reverberated through every corner of the town, a testament to the resilience of human spirit in the face of sorrow, to the unyielding power of truth, and to the silent, steadfast vigil of a dog on a playground swing. And as the seasons turned and Maplewood began to rewrite its narrative, there lingered the soft, unbreakable promise that even in the darkest chapters, a spark of hope could illuminate the path to healing.